Oil spills. Did you even really pay attention the last time you saw one on the news? Sadly, oil spills happen often enough that we may simply accept them as a part of life. And if the media doesn't continue reporting on it, well, surely it's not a problem anymore, right? Well, no. Obviously not, right? The news only picks up on the sensational bits, and the rest is relegated to environmental magazines or a documentary that nobody is going to watch. And if you count all the spills that take place during activities like refueling and drilling, as many as thousands of oil spills take place every year. The extent of a spill will usually be measured in gallons, tons, or barrels. So, which oil spill has had the worst impact so far? (1991), not a good year for Kuwait. There was an oil spill, but also oil wells that were set alight on purpose, all because of politics in the Gulf War. First, the Iraqi military forces were retreating and applying a scorched earth policy. They set oil wells alight, and it's estimated that between 600 and 700 wells were burned. The fires were started around January and February, but it took until April to extinguish the first ones and until the end of the year for the final well to be capped. In conjunction with all the smoke billowing into the air, the other disaster was the oil spill into the Persian Gulf. Even though Iraq stated they weren't responsible, strategically this helped them by stopping the US from doing a water landing and giving assistance. Estimations for the spill range from 252 million to 336 million barrels of oil. For this disaster, there were some cleanup efforts, since of course they wanted to recover the spilt oil, but the Gulf War was raging, so projects were hampered, and in the end, even though a lot of oil was skimmed off the water's surface, beaches weren't as lucky. As much as 375 miles of coast got affected and wasn't properly cleaned. Based on the circumstances, some called this disaster environmental terrorism. And as if the war wasn't enough to ruin industries, the spill ruined certain fishing activities forever. Even though coral in the region was less affected than expected, other areas could take decades to recover. The Lakeview gusher was another disaster that played out over a long period of time. In 1910, in Kern Country, California, a pressurized oil well erupted. Reasons included a lack of planning and safety measures because the system had no blowout preventers, so 9 million barrels of oil, or 378 million gallons, managed to blow out. To be fair, the Lakeview Oil Company never thought they would come across that amount of oil. They started drilling because they were after the natural gas, but when they reached a depth of 2,240 feet, oil blew the well casing and gushed out. The spill lasted for 18 months, and to contain the oil, they improvised sand dams and dikes, but the flow increased from around 19,000 to 90,000 barrels a day, and it went on for over 540 days. Another solution they implemented was a pipeline carrying the oil to storage tanks, but despite these efforts, experts say that less than 50% of the oil actually got saved. The rest seeped into the soil or evaporated, having immense environmental impact. One small piece of good news is that at least with all of that oil exposed, it never caught fire. Next on our list is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is the largest marine oil spill ever, and it happened in 2010. To put this spill in numbers, 210 million gallons of oil leaked into the sea. Here, again, the damage was done over the course of an extensive period, with oil escaping into the Gulf of Mexico for 87 days before the leak was sealed. Deepwater Horizon was a drilling rig chartered by BP at the time. The problem started on the 20th of April 2010 when methane gas expanded and rose into the rig, then ignited, causing a massive explosion. Although over 90 crew members were rescued, 11 people were never found. 2 days later, the rig sank, but then they discovered oil was leaking, and it didn't stop until the well was sealed on the 19th of September 2010. The area this oil leak had an effect on is about the size of the state of Oklahoma. 70,000 square miles was directly impacted, and during the next 2 years, problems arose in places as far as Texas, Florida, and Alabama. For this oil spill, there were skimming and burning cleanup attempts, with 47,000 people involved to try and contain, disperse, or remove oil. Containment booms measured 4.2 million feet long, all to try and limit the effect on areas like marshes and oyster ranches. The initial stage took 7,000 vessels and cost around $850 million. With additional activities, it cost $14 billion by January 2013, and only in 2014 did BP report that the coastal cleanup was finished. But still, reports stated that only a quarter of the spilled oil was recovered, and the event also released a lot of hydrocarbon gas. Of course, BP's reputation suffered because of the disaster, and it impacted marine life and tourism for years to come. BP also faced a lawsuit with plaintiffs accusing them of negligence and willful misconduct. 5 years after the disaster, BP agreed to a settlement of $18 billion, taking into account their expenses for the cleanup, penalties, and damages. BP had to shell out over $50 billion. Another oil spill that happened at a drilling rig was the Ixtoc-1 oil spill. Ixtoc-1 was an exploratory oil well being worked on by Pemex, the Mexican state-owned petroleum company. This disaster also took place in the Gulf of Mexico in June 1979 when a blowout caused oil to spill into the ocean. The problem with these kind of spills is how long it takes to fix the problem, mostly because it's so difficult to work deep underwater. Only in July could Pemex reduce the flow of oil by pumping mud into the well. This caused the flow to become 20,000 barrels a day instead of 30,000. In August, they placed balls made of steel and lead into the well, which took the flow down to just 10,000 barrels a day. Other techniques included drilling relief wells, but it still took around 10 months before the leak stopped. The facts and numbers show the magnitude of this spill. For example, they treated over 1,000 square miles of ocean with dispersants, and this took almost 500 aerial missions. US beach areas along 162 miles of coastline were implicated, and the effects were seen as far as Texas because oil travels wherever the current takes it. Where oil washed onto the shore, it was sometimes as much as a foot deep. The spill also affected Mexico's fishing industry, with catches for certain species dropping as much as 70%. Pemex did launch a cleanup operation, and this cost the company about $100 million, but it took a decade for some turtle species population to show recovery. Unfortunately, no human or company ever really took responsibility for this disaster. Thanks to sovereign immunity, Pemex barely paid any compensatory claims. Now for a story about an oil tanker. This oil spill happened in 1979 when two oil tankers, a Greek ship called the Atlantic Empress and the Caribbean Aegean Captain, collided. The collision was simply because of bad weather and the ship's inability to maneuver quickly enough once they spotted each other. On the ocean, being 600 yards apart was not enough to turn and avoid that collision. Both ships had damage, fires to contain, and even lost crew members. However, while the Aegean Captain could be taken to Curaçao to unload the cargo, the Atlantic Empress was leaking her oil into the ocean, and within about 2 weeks, the Empress sank. Before she sank, experts did their best to minimize the extent of the oil spill, such as towing the tanker deeper into the ocean, further from land, but 287,000 tons of crude oil ended up in the sea, which is over 2 million barrels. That's a sad story, both for the loss of human life and the mass of oil that ended up in the Caribbean Sea. Next is the Fergana Valley disaster, which is the most devastating oil spill that ever happened in Asia, and it's the largest inland disaster of its kind. You may also hear this disaster called the Ming Balak oil spill, after the specific oil field in Fergana Valley, which is in Uzbekistan. Blowouts seem to be a common occurrence for these massive disasters, and it also happened in Fergana Valley. This one happened at the beginning of March in 1992, and to help contain over 280,000 tons of crude oil, they built dikes. The oil flowed until it stopped by itself, but unfortunately, unlike the Lakeview gusher, the oil did catch fire, and it kept burning for 2 months. You can see the numbers for these disasters is getting smaller, but a comparatively small spill can still ruin the environment. And imagine if it's multiple small spills. At Nowruz Field in Iran at the start of 1983, a tank hit a platform. This started a spill, and as part of attacks during the Iran-Iraq War, in March, that same platform got shot at by helicopters. Unfortunately, the oil caught fire. Similar to what happened in Kuwait, the war affects various activities, so technicians couldn't attend to the problem as swiftly as usual. So it took until September 1983 to cap the well with cement. After this, another helicopter attack hit a different platform, and another leak ensued. Luckily, this time it took only around 2 months before the cap was put in place, but 9 people lost their lives during the process. As a result of these 2 major leaks, 260,000 tons of oil ended up being spilled. The ABT summer disaster took place just off Angola's coast and involved a 344-meter-long oil tanker which sank in 1991. The cause was an explosion on the ship, and it cost 5 people their lives while creating the leak that allowed 260,000 tons of oil to escape. If you looked at it from above, you'd have seen a stain in the water 20 miles long and 4 miles wide. Now, the numbers can give you an idea of the size and impact of a spill, but like I've said, don't underestimate the damage of lesser events. Now, that wraps up our major oil spills today, but we thought we'd look at 5 smaller but still devastating spills that caused a lot of damage. Torrey Canyon was an oil tanker which ran aground on the Cornwall coast, mostly because of human error. Among other things, attempts to limit the spill's impact included burning the oil by dropping bombs of 1,000 pounds each. But since it was at sea, water kept dousing the flames, so the mission used over 160 bombs and 44,000 litres of kerosene. The disaster involved about 120,000 tons of crude oil. Number 2. Amoco Cadiz is another tanker that ran ashore in 1978 near Brittany in France. Causes included bad weather and mechanical failure. This led to over 220,000 tons of oil escaping because there wasn't enough time to pump any of it out of the ship before it broke up and sank. Number 3. Another oil tanker, the Odyssey, sank after an explosion and dumped more than 132,000 tons of its cargo into the seas near Nova Scotia. Because the explosion resulted in fires and the oil slick around the ship was burning, rescue vessels couldn't come near it, and so the entire crew perished. In this case, much of the oil burnt. Number 4. After a Taylor Energy oil platform was destroyed during a hurricane, oil started spilling out. This took place in 2004 and it's still going on today. If the leak isn't tended to, it can carry on for a century, and Taylor Energy says there isn't much else that can be done. They've already spent $400 million on limiting the flow, which is now down to a few hundred barrels a day. So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed today's video, but if you found it interesting, please do click that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you for watching.